Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of The Internationalist. I missed seeing you guys last week. I was a bit sick, having just come back from the BELMARSH tribunal in London. And this week, we're unfortunately missing David. Thankfully, not on account of being sick. He's in Italy doing some very important work and hoping to bring you, all of you, an exclusive story. So stay tuned for that. So last week, we held a discussion between Pink Floyd's Roger Waters and investigative journalist Stefania Morizzi on Julian Assange's extradition hearing. This, of course, followed the historic BELMARSH tribunal, and this episode, along with all of the others before it, is available on this channel, which I hope you're already subscribed to. The full tribunal, which convenes speakers including Tariq Ali, Edward Snowden, Jeremy Corbyn, Salai Ghaffar, is now available on Novara Media's YouTube channel. You can find the link in the subscription below. Now, this week, in the middle of COP26, which is the climate conference in Glasgow, we turn to analyze the first 10 months of the Biden regime in the United States of America. From economic stagnation to the Cold War in China, the US under Joe Biden is plunging down in what we've called an Imperial Abyss, as today's episode is titled. With that, welcome to The Internationalist. Before I introduce our guest for today, I want to bring you some updates from the Progressive International Secretariat. In Italy's southern region of Calabria, a small town called Riace has been celebrated for creating a visionary model of welcoming refugees and creating a safe haven or a safe town for them to live and work in. Now, one of the leaders behind this visionary model, behind this project in the town of Riace, is called Domenico Lucano, who is the former mayor, also known lovingly as Mimo by everyone in the town and all of his friends. Now, Mimo's dream was to bring sort of what was an abandoned place back to life and make it welcoming for migrants coming in from inhospitable, from vulnerable places around the world, and creating a community in Riace where they could live and work while seeking asylum. And for over a decade, he was successful at doing this. He was able to do this successfully in the town. But something changed in 2018. He was charged by the courts. He was arrested. He was barred from entering the town of Riace, and he lost his position as the mayor. Now, about a month ago, things came to a head when he got sentenced to 13 years and 2 months in jail. Now, this wasn't even what the prosecutors were asking for, so it's a far more of a stringent sentence than anyone was expecting. So the judgment, of course, led to a wave of protests, and it triggered a debate about immigration policies, about the judiciary in Italy and elsewhere. Now, David, who's not here for today's episode, is in Italy right now meeting with Mimo, and will bring you an exclusive interview with the former mayor very soon. So please do stay tuned for that and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now, if we can move on to the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26 as it's called, most of the world leaders are currently now in Glasgow in Scotland. Now, ahead of the conference, we've just published a terrific essay on Blueprint, the policy pillar of Progressive International, called Climate Justice Means Debt Justice by Jerome Phelps and Tess Wolfenden of the Jubilee Debt Campaign. You'll remember that about a year ago now, we set out to develop a blueprint of debt justice, combining a systematic critique of the international financial system with a comprehensive vision for its transformation. Now, this collection was put together by a diverse group of scholars and activists who aim really to stand with activists on the ground, on the front lines, armed with facts, armed with figures and analytical frameworks to make sense of the present crisis and to break out of it. Now, in this new essay, Jerome and Tess make a very simple argument. Countries in the global south, which are the least responsible for carbon emissions and the climate crisis, are feeling its impacts most severely. So it's clear, right? There's a climate debt that's owed. It's owed by the richest countries whose carbon emissions, through centuries of industrialization, made possible by colonial extraction, has been the principal cause of the climate crisis. So understandably, all of the global leaders around the world have been demanding one single thing: debt cancellation for climate justice. And that's been clear ahead of the COP26, ahead of the conference as well. But this year's climate conference has already been dubbed the most exclusionary in the conference's history. Let's see why that is, right? There's a radical disparity in the kind of things that are being said on the inside of the UNFCCC and outside on the streets of Glasgow. On the inside, leaders like Narendra Modi have already announced that he's committing India to a net zero target, which is decades outside the conference's goals. On the outside, Greenpeace activists have arrived on their ship, the Rainbow Warrior, convening protesters from Namibia, Uganda, Mexico, and Bangladesh, with protesters from Fridays for Future. Now, Greta Thunberg announced to a crowd gathered in Glasgow several days ago that change is not going to come from inside there. That's not leadership. This is leadership. Those were her words. Now, her words reflect international concern that COP26 is essentially nothing more than a talking shop. As negotiations and speeches continue, we should be, and we continue to be, hugely skeptical of our governments. Now, this is especially poignant considering that the Scottish and the UK governments narrowly avoided a complete shutdown of the city of Glasgow itself, brought on by striking workers in the refuse and transport industries. So austere cuts in managements of these public services during the pandemic has led to workers in Glasgow and across Scotland, in fact, demanding better treatment and better pay. In the transport industry, for instance, rail workers had already been on strike for months, but it's only the threat of shutdown of Glasgow during the conference that forced the government's hand and pay rises were agreed. My comrades from the PI Secretariat, including Col McHale, a youth activist whose videos you might have seen protesting in Glasgow, will continue to bring you exclusive news and updates from the conference over the next week. So with all of this in mind, let's introduce our guests, Yanis Varoufakis and Richard Wolff. Yanis Varoufakis is a PI Council member who has been a part of many PI events, including the BELMARSH Tribunal a few weeks ago. He's a member of the Hellenic Parliament and the Secretary General of MERA 25. He's a co-founder also of DiEM25 and the former Finance Minister of Greece. He's the author of several books, including Adults in the Room and The Weak Must Suffer What They Must. Now, Richard Wolff is a US Marxist economist known for his work on economic methodology and class analysis. He's Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School in New York. And he runs the project Democracy at Work and brings something called an economic update each week. If you liked the show, subscribe to the Progressive International YouTube channel. It'll only take you 2 seconds. Click the bell icon, turn on the notification so that you know about our next episode and any time that we publish new content. Progressive International, as you know, is funded exclusively by people and supporters like you. We receive no public or government grants. And so if you enjoy our shows, you like us, you believe in the work that we do, and believe that the time has come for an international infrastructure for progressives all around the world and for us all to unite in a common front, then head to progressive.international/support to donate and help us build it. We'll see you next week, same place, same time. Over to you, Yanis and Richard, and thanks so much for coming on to The Internationalist.
I'm in Manhattan, in New York City.
And I'm in Athens. Hello, Rick.
All right.
Hello from Athens.
Hi. Hello from New York City, where we are having a big storm right now, but we should be better shortly.
Good to know.
Let me start with a couple of comments about the first year of Mr. Biden, and then we see how it looks from your angle. Mr. Biden came into office with an enormous sigh of relief here in the United States that Mr. Trump was gone. This quickly changed as it became clear that Mr. Trump wasn't gone, that he is staying, and that he is building his plans on an insistence that he in fact won the election and that it had been stolen from him. And he has continued without interruption to push that argument. In the face of that, Mr. Biden has made an effort over the first year to respond to the two major failures of Mr. Trump that basically cost him the presidency. The failure to deal with COVID and the failure to deal with the economic crash that hit this country a little bit before COVID did. The economic the NBER dates the downturn from February of 2020, and the COVID didn't hit here until a month later, March of 2020. And Mr. Trump presided over the catastrophe of COVID and the catastrophe of the economic downturn. To give you just one idea, over the last 18 months, somewhere around 85 million American workers were unemployed. Some of them were only unemployed a few weeks, some of them the whole time, and some in between. But that is more than 1/2 of the labor force in this country. It means that 1 out of 2 workers were thrown out of work. And unlike much of Europe, there was no guarantee that they would ever get these jobs back. The employers were allowed basically to fire them. And what we're seeing in the United States right now is a resurgence of the labor movement. It's early. It's not clear how long it will last, but it is remarkable. And part of the reason is the jobs to which people return were much poorer than the jobs they left, because in the interval, they have squeezed the situation, and that has provoked a reaction in the labor movement. Mr. Biden focused his activity on proposing, in effect, a kind of version of the 1930s New Deal. In other words, he tried to associate himself with Roosevelt. He tried to suggest that you needed a big program of several trillions of dollars worth of program to repair the neglected infrastructure, but also in a general way to provide social services to catch up to what already exists in a number of European countries, and which has never existed here. Basically, Mr. Biden has failed to do that. The COVID situation is improved because of vaccination, so he gets some credit for that. The situation is not as bad as when he came into office. But the economic situation has not changed at all. The inequality gets worse. The domination and power of the capitalist class continues pretty much without interruption. And finally, the Republicans and the business community are successful in forcing Biden to reduce his program to 1/3 or so of what it originally was. Mm-hmm. And that means that we have in the United States now a growing disappointment with Mr. Biden on the left, more and more questions about whether Bernie Sanders and what he represents should have fallen in with Biden the way he did, or should have tried an alternative strategy. But it is clear to me, and I'd like to know how Yanis feels about this, it's clear to me that the folks who run the United States economy are determined to continue pretty much the way they always have. Nothing for them, they think, has changed. And you can see it perhaps most clearly in the foreign policy, in which they act towards China and towards Russia and towards many others as if the last 30 years had changed nothing. But I must tell you that below the official surface of American political economy, the rumblings of disagreement, of discontent, of alternatives has never been stronger in my lifetime. The ability to talk about socialism openly, the ability to say, for example, publicly, that the American empire has peaked and it is now downhill in this culture with all of the trauma and difficulty, that is now a widely held discussion. And you're seeing cracks in what used to be a solid face of U.S. capitalism that is a result both of criticisms from the left, but also internal fractures that are becoming deeper and deeper with each passing week. So that's how it looks to me. Yanis, tell me a little bit about how it looks from where you sit.
I'm not going to give you a contradictory picture to yours, because it looks pretty much like that from here too. But allow me to be complementary by also confirming that Joe Biden proved slightly more progressive than what I was expecting. But of course, it's a question of initial expectations. I had a very small, a tiny little basket that I brought to this business. And therefore, it was not difficult for Joe Biden to impress me with how much more radical he was. The early pronouncements for a Green New Deal of sorts, a very large sum of money that was being bandied about, something up to $4 trillion. That was a lot more than I had expected. Right. Now, of course, the cynic would say that he knew very well he wouldn't be able to push this through Congress because he didn't have the numbers, and therefore it was no skin off his nose to come up with a very large number to attract the left that elected him, Bernie Sanders, the Squad, and so on, the Democratic Socialists of America, knowing that he was on safe conservative ground, because he could always say, well, I tried, but Congress was not going to go for it or with it. But I don't want to be cynical. So I'm prepared to take it on face value that he meant it. Even if he did, I don't believe that he has won the right to be speaking in terms of FDR Mark II, of a New Deal. And the reason is this. Even if he meant the $4 trillion, even if he had managed to push it through, the New Deal had another important component to it, which Joe Biden's agenda simply lacked. And that was putting the financial genie back into the bottle. Roosevelt did two things. Not only did he use public financial instruments in order to energize and to mobilize existing liquidity and to press it into the service of public works, but he also put the bankers into their bottle in a series of shackles that constrained them for decades to come. Biden was never going to do that. And that is crucial, because we live in the era of QE. I'll come back to this in a moment. So it was only half the New Deal. And that half was not delivered because he didn't have the numbers. So even if we are completely and utterly motivated by good faith, we can't possibly condone the view that he is a new Roosevelt. At best, he would be a new LBJ, in the sense of a great society, a progressive agenda regarding minorities, regarding the LGBT community and so on, which is a very good thing, right? But remember, of course, I don't need to remind you, Rick, but I'm addressing our younger members of the audience, that LBJ simultaneously persecuted a very right-wing, reactionary, militaristic, genocidal, I would even say, agenda abroad. In Vietnam, in my country, we had a dictatorship that was instigated by the CIA and the Pentagon under the LBJ administration, while at the same time reducing poverty and spending large as part of the Great Society. So if there is a previous administration, democratic administration, that I would associate with Biden, it would be LBJ. Except that LBJ had the numbers in Congress and he managed to push the Great Society through, and Biden doesn't have the numbers. And now I shall come back to the question of the banks, of the financial sector. Biden comes to power a decade plus after the great financial collapse of 2008, a decade during which capitalism had morphed into something quite different. I personally prefer to refer to it as techno-feudalism, but that's my predilection. The fundamental, profound difference is that after April 2009, the central banks of the G7, led by the Federal Reserve, start printing mountain ranges of money by which to refloat the financial sector, to save the bankers, and to practice what I call socialism for the bankers, for the very, very few, and harsh austerity for everyone else, in the United States, in the European Union, in the United Kingdom. And this creates permanent deficits when it comes to aggregate demand, permanently substandard aggregate demand, while there is the largest amount of liquidity in the financial sector. That creates asset price inflation, turbocharges inequality. Inequality means that the savings ratio goes further up, savings begin to pile up, nothing to do with demography, nothing to do with the baby boomers saving more. This is all rubbish. It's all to do with the 1% of the 1% having so much dough as a result of the printing practices of the central banks of the G7. And this inequality and the savings ratio that it produces creates an even greater excess savings stash, which depresses interest rates further. That creates more zombies. That gives more power to corporations, even the corporations that never had any profits. So we never had such low levels of profitability across the capitalist sector with such hefty increases in wealth for the very, very few. So this is what he inherits. The pandemic comes in, and this is turbocharged, because all that the authorities do, the institutions of capitalism do, is just do more of the same. Much, much more of the same. Much more money printing, while at the same time, and you described it perfectly well, practicing in the labor markets policies that effectively shrink the wage share. So this is the situation we have, and this situation has nothing to do with the New Deal. Setting totally and utterly aside as irrelevant Joe Biden's personal preferences. This is a phase in which really existing capitalism is stagnating more than ever, while capitalists are experiencing the highest growth rate in their paper asset values, in their wealth, in the history of the last 300 years. And Joe Biden has no policy about this. He pretends it's not happening. Simply the pretense that it is not happening is a contribution by his administration in what is going on. And therefore he stands in front of us as the main accused of aiding and abetting a process which is absolutely unsustainable, which creates deflation in the assets of the vast majority of the population, huge inflation in the assets of the 1%, and maybe the 1% of the 1%, while at the same time inflationary forces, as a result of the disruption to supply chains, attack what spending power the have-nots have. In other words, from a perspective of the future, Joe Biden's administration is going to be remembered as a major contributor to a dynamic that paves the ground for what I referred to fleetingly before as techno-feudalism. And by that, what I mean, Rick, is this. This is one Marxist to another speaking. Capitalism has morphed a number of times. It's gone through, like COVID-19, it had many variants. It had this alpha variant back in the 19th century, the baker, the brewer, the butcher. It had the beta variant in monopoly capital, the network company of Thomas Edison, of Henry Ford, and so on. Then it went through, after the Great Depression and the New Deal, it went through the kind of techno-structure that John Kenneth Galbraith described. It went through the Bretton Woods era of globalization through a central plan with fixed exchange rates and capital controls. Then this whole thing collapsed on the 15th of August 1971. Then we had the era of financialized rentier capitalism. All these capitalisms were very different one from the other. But they share one thing, actually two things they share between them. First, they share profitability. The profit, private capitalist profit, is the fuel of the system, has always been, with all those variants. And the second thing is, markets are the locus of exploitation. Markets are the locus of value creation and extraction, whether it's the labor market, the real estate market, the money markets, the market. But think about it, in the last 12, 13 years, both of these pillars, profitability and markets, are waning. Instead of profits driving the system, today it's central bank money. It's sovereign money, issued by a powerless state, a state which is in the pocket, not of the sovereign, not of the state itself, but of the oligarchy. And the second thing that is happening is increasingly we have the fragmentation of markets and their steady replacement by platforms, by companies like Amazon. Once you enter Amazon, you exit capitalism. You enter a kind of fiefdom. It's a digital fiefdom, where everything is, what is supplied, what is purchased, what is advertised, what you see, what you don't see, is determined by an algorithm belonging to one man. That is not capitalism. Amazon is not capitalism. Google is not capitalism. Facebook is not capitalism. It's a tech fiefdom. So if you combine the erosion of profitability and the steady and replacement of markets by platforms, and think of also of other companies that are not platforms, which are taken over by private equity, split up between a holding company owning the buildings, which are used as collateral to add huge amounts of debt. Then the other part that provides work and services, the second part of the company, becomes effectively a debt slave to the first company. This whole agglomeration has no profits. So this is what I'm talking about. This is a major transformation. Maybe you think of it as capitalism. I don't think of it as capitalism anymore. You see, we leftists used to dream that after capitalism something better would come. I think that something much worse is coming. We're coming back to feudalism, only a digital version of that. And Biden's administration is providing the cultural legitimacy for that transformation, and also the funding through a stimulus program, which in the end, unlike the very good efforts of Bernie Sanders, possibly because of the numbers in the Senate, this money is not going to be spent in that direction. And if you compare and contrast the amount of money in this stimulus program with the amount that the Fed is printing, and the amount that the Fed is allowing private banks to print behind everybody's backs, including the Feds, then you see that this administration is presiding over a kind of oligarchy that is even more distant from capitalism than feudalism was.
No, I find much in what you say very, very persuasive. I do think that, if I can revert a little bit to psychology for a moment, that the United States expresses to itself and to the rest of us looking at it nothing so much as is captured by the word denial. There's a denial of what you've just said, a denial of the challenges, even to the basics of capitalism as it has grown up in the past. I'm reminded of the denial of what is going on and what is represented by China. I mean, the absence of a serious conversation in this country about what is going on there and what it means for capitalism, what it means for the United States, is astonishing in the scope of it. It is like confronting a child, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, who sees a scary dog and who puts her hands in front of her eyes because she believes, since she's 2 or 3, that if you don't see the dog, it isn't there. You know, and then you grow up and you realize that the dog is still there. I find it amazing, not only that these changes that you talk about are underway, and the farcical discussions in Washington that are vaguely trying to put some control on Facebook or Google or Apple or the others, and failing left and right to do it, even to the point where exposés, WikiLeaks and things like that, showing what they're doing, still kind of don't have the power to generate any kind of serious pushback. There is a sense of an empire really unraveling itself. If perhaps you and I have a bit of a disagreement, yeah, I see what you're saying about a techno-feudalism. But from here, it looks more and more like a government that's resorting to the printing press the way kingdoms in 400 years ago resorted to the printing press.
Feudalism.
Yeah, when the monarch, yes, when the monarch couldn't do it anymore, he printed things that looked like silver and gold, but were actually made out of the famous base metals. It was the desperate effort to somehow hold on to what, and you're right, it's not a sustainable arrangement. This amount of money, I mean, you mentioned, and I assume you mean the same thing as we say in America now, about a fifth of our corporations are so-called zombie corporations. They are not earning enough net revenue to cover their debts. And the only way they keep going is by borrowing more to pay off the debts they can't pay, which means next year, unless there's a miracle, they will be even more zombified than they were before. The government is in unsustainable debt. The corporations are more and more in unsustainable debt. Households cannot navigate the level of debts they have accumulated. No one knows what an economic downturn might mean when the web of indebtedness means that it spreads everywhere almost instantaneously. And so there's a great kind of refusal to face almost any of this. And you're right, Biden is presiding because the country as a whole is presiding over not understanding what's happening, having no idea of where to go different from what's going on, and so kind of sliding down an incline that has only an abyss at the end. Let me pose you a question, though, because you are a European. There's also the sense here in the United States that something is beginning to happen that is shaking the subordination of Europe, Western Europe, to the United States. England, of course, but not the rest. That somehow there's a struggle in the Europeans not knowing which way to go. What's your view? And by the way, by which way I mean with the United States or with China?
Oh, I wish, Rick. I wish. But I'm not optimistic on this. Let me give you an example. Tiny pipsqueak country called Greece, right? My country. A month ago, I was sitting in the House of Parliament, and I lead a left-wing political party in there called Mera 25. The Prime Minister, right-wing Prime Minister, came in and tabled a Greek-French defense cooperation agreement, which he presented as a great opportunity to pivot towards Europe, as he put it. This is consistent with what you were saying. In other words, to shift out of the sphere of influence of the United States and come closer to France. It was a fiasco. It was never serious. All that happened was AUKUS, the Australian, United Kingdom, United States agreement, which effectively threw France off a beautiful deal that France had with Australia. Biden and Boris Johnson cut a deal with the Australian government to provide them for a huge amount of money nuclear-powered submarines, as if this is what Australia needed. The only effect that they will have is up the ante in the Pacific and reduce the chances of peace with China. So France was really peeved. Effectively, Biden pocketed $70 billion that France had thought it was going to be collected from the Aussies. And what Biden did was to say to Macron, okay, after Macron had reached the stage of withdrawing his ambassador from Washington, D.C. This is what you do just before you starting a war with a country, right? So this is between allies. So Macron was very pissed off. And that lasted a week. Biden bought him off with a deal with Greece. So effectively he said, okay, the Greeks were going to buy some frigates from the US Navy, second-hand ones. They can buy them off you. So that, for a paltry sum of something like $7 billion, Macron was bought out. And this was presented here in Greece as us shifting away from the sphere of influence of the United States and, doing a deal with Europe, with France. Now, how can I prove that this was just pretense? Well, last week, 3 weeks later, we have a new Greece-United States of America defense treaty that is being tabled in Parliament, and it is a purely colonial piece of work. We are signing away to the United States armed forces the whole of Greece. They can do anything they want with it. They can build bases wherever they want, without even taking it to the Greek Parliament again. It's indefinite. It lasts forever. It's like saying, my house is your house. So I very much fear that, look, let me be succinct on this. There are many Europeans who would like to become more independent from Washington, D.C. There are some Europeans who would like to see the end of NATO and a European defense alliance emerging. That's never going to happen. It's for the same reason why the euro is never going to become a competitor to the American dollar. Because even though many Europeans would like the euro to become a competitor to the American dollar, if you do not have a common bond, the equivalent of the US treasuries, your currency, however strong and beautiful it may be, is never going to compete. Because, when the Chinese buy stuff from America, sell stuff to America, right, they get dollars. And what do? They buy US treasuries. When they sell stuff to Europe, what are they going to get? We don't have euro treasuries because we don't have a solid a federal state. And the oligarchies of Europe do not want a federal state. You know why they don't want it? Because they do not want federal elections. Because now they control the whole continent of 500 million people, without elections, behind closed doors. But the price they have to pay for that is exorbitant dollar. The exorbitant power of the dollar, and of course, along that comes the exorbitant power of the American hegemon when it comes to geopolitics. So they will continue to be subservient to Washington, D.C. They kick and scream and they get upset with Americans when the Americans invade Iraq, when the Americans take their submarine deals with Australia away from them. But nothing is going to change in that. The European Union remains absolutely subservient to the hegemony of the United States. The only way
Do
that
you
is going to
think there's
change,
any-
the only way that is going to change is if we win. That is, the left wins. If there is an internationalist movement, like, the one we're trying to build up across Europe with doing the M25, and we actually, take power, then things will change. But they will kill us first before we manage to do this.
Just one small question. Do you think there was much meaning in the conflict between the United States and Germany about the Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia?
Yes, there was, because Germany, beginning with Willy Brandt in the 1970s, had a policy of somehow finding an accommodation with Moscow. Back then, under the Soviet Union, now under Putin. And Germany has a very serious energy supply problem, especially after Fukushima, when Merkel very opportunistically effectively severed her relationship with nuclear power and shut nuclear power stations down. The green transition, moving away from lignite, from coal, means reliance on natural gas. And the obvious supplier here in Europe, in Northern Europe, is Putin, Gazprom, the Russians. So there was a bit of a clash, especially with Trump. Trump was adamant that Nord Stream would not happen. But Biden has given in on this, it seems. So that is gone. This is not even an issue anymore. Biden has tacitly accepted Nord Stream 2. The French are putting up a little bit of a struggle because they want to sell their own nuclear power stations. But, these are the typical clashes, minor clashes between different capitalist interests within the European continent. I don't think they have a greater, broader global significance.
Okay, let me turn the conversation to another aspect of Biden. We have two statistics here in the United States that have become important for people to talk about. One is the rate of workers coming back to their jobs after the pandemic, working for a week or two or three, and quitting. We have a quit rate that we haven't seen in decades. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we have an upsurge in strike activity, organized labor union strikes. Nabisco, Kellogg, John Deere tractors, and many, many others. Even now, when union leaders have reached an acceptable contract, they are facing opposition from the rank and file voting about a contract that they haven't seen in quite a while. What are we to make of all of this? How are we going to explain, and particularly, how is the left going to look at, relate to, take a position toward this combination of workers angry at the system and quitting, angry at the system and striking, and increasingly being willing to talk about capitalism in a negative perspective, and socialism, meaning very different things, of course, but socialism in an increasingly positive way. And last point, the younger the person, the better the political for us, so that, for example, the majority of the people I talk to are 35 years of age or younger. And that is true for more and more of the left here in the United States. How do you think about, how does all of that look to you?
Well, firstly, the pandemic has had a very good effect in that sense, because a kind of basic income was provided during lockdown. And that allowed people to think, my goodness, it is possible to live reasonably decently. And, the money tree can work for us too, not just for the bankers. That is very empowering. at the very same time, when you stop doing bullshit jobs, even for a few months, even lockdown, you get an opportunity to reassess, not to take for granted that you are somebody who has been determined by divine intervention to do bullshit jobs forever. And I think that what we are seeing to a large extent, in Europe as well, not just in the United States, is people saying no. They got a whiff of freedom. A whiff of freedom. And that, I think, plays a very important role. That's point number one. Point number two is the left. What are we doing in order to organize these people? Because this is a spontaneous eruption of that anti-capitalist spirit that we are not responsible for. And I very much fear that we're not doing much in order to cultivate it, in order to give it voice, and in order to organize it. You mentioned Bernie Sanders before in your introduction. I think that Bernie couldn't have done anything different to what he did after 2020. But my criticism of Bernie, with all the love and admiration and affection I have for him, concerns 2016. That's when he should have stepped out of the Democratic Party and created a third force, a socialist party in the United States. Because had he done that in 2016, now we would be in a position to have a party that actually organizes these workers. We don't have that party. We cannot do it through squads, we cannot do it through caucuses, we cannot do it through the Democratic Party in the United States. We couldn't do it here in Greece through Syriza, through the PASOK, through existing establishment parties. We need a party whose agenda coincides with the agenda of the working class, the precariat, the care workers, the maintainers of that society, of this society, even the young innovators who work for nothing for years, hoping that at some point, Google will buy them out. It is never late to start building a political force from scratch.
Is something like this happening in Europe? Would you say that there is either a quitting or a striking? Did the pandemic cause a reassessment in the working class of Europe, and is it similar, different? How do you see that?
It's similar. I'll give you an example here in Greece. The precariat organized itself in a way that was remarkable. Delivery workers who were, very crucial workers during the lockdown and who have been traditionally treated like fodder by ridiculously awful bosses. They organized a strike here in Greece in the last few weeks that actually paralyzed the sector. And the main culprit company that was trying to turn them into zero-hour contract workers had to back down. We see similar things happening in Portugal, in Spain, in Germany, in Britain. But again, the failure of the left to support these movements in a meaningful way by means of political parties that do not exploit those spontaneous workers' movements but are there to support them. That's where the left is lacking also in Europe. Here in Greece we're doing a pretty decent job at providing that support with our party. But again, we are very far off. There's a huge disconnect between this wave of discontent sweeping through primarily the precariat and our political organizations.
Where do you think China fits into this story?
Oh, it's crucial. Look, Donald Trump was a visionary bastard. He was a bastard, but he was a visionary bastard. And you can see that because Biden is taking one leaf out of, after the next from Trump's book. The targeting of China as an enemy of the United States and the instigation of a new Cold War was Trump's work, and Biden is continuing. What is the real issue about China? What do they want from China? Because, let's face it, Apple doesn't like it. They produce all their iPhones there. So what is this? This is not a repetition of the Cold War, the original one against the Soviet Union. The American industry was not producing anything in the Soviet Union prior to 1989. So what are they doing here? Look, my estimation, Rick, is that there are two sectors that they want to take over in China. Two sectors that really piss them off, that they do not control. One is Chinese big tech. Because let's face it, Europe is useless. We don't have a Google competitor, an Amazon competitor, a Facebook competitor, a Netflix competitor, right? This is all American, and Europe has nothing. We are totally in the clasps of American imperialism when it comes to this. The Chinese have huge conglomerates doing excellent work. You know, they have their own Twitter, they have their own Facebook, they have their own Google, they have their own Amazon, they have their own Apple in Huawei, right? And they produce better 5G networks and faster trains than anybody in the world. And they want their hands on this. American big tech wants to penetrate and take over the data management systems of the Chinese big tech. This is what Trump was aiming at. He was effectively blackmailing the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, Cold War, maybe a hot war, or you let us access your data services. That was one area. And the second area is finance, of course. Finance has always been in the eye of, Chinese finance has always been in the eye of Wall Street. The Chinese very smartly are maintaining their barriers, their capital controls. This is actually good even for capitalism, for the American economy, but the administrations in Washington D.C. are not clever enough to understand that if this real estate bubble bursts, then it's good to have these barriers up, but they want those barriers down because they want, they want to expand into finance in China. So this is what the new Cold War is about. It's a very dangerous business, and it's a very stupid strategy by Washington D.C.
And why?
Well, because firstly, we may end up with a war in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits, in Taiwan itself, a war that nobody is going to win. And secondly, because Biden must understand that which Trump didn't. But I don't think that Biden is smarter than Trump. After all, he's a nicer man, but he's not smarter. That a very cruel God would grant him his wish and lower the capital control barriers with China, for the reasons I said. Because then any crisis in the shadow banking system in China, for instance, would immediately be transmitted to the United States.
My feeling on this subject, and it's worth a conversation itself, is that you have here a descending American empire and an ascending Chinese empire, symbolized by the high tech, symbolized by the kind of mobilization of public and private resources. Here in the United States, that we have 1/4 the population of China and 100 times the number of COVID deaths compared to China. The level of failure is so symbolic of the whole economic reality. 2/3 of the world's fast trains are in China. None of them are here in the United States.
Oh, you have Amtrak. You have Amtrak.
Amtrak, that's right. We have Amtrak and a Acela from Boston to Washington, and that doesn't qualify as a fast train.
I'm joking.
I think here in the United States, one of the greatest dangers we have is it's the end of our empire. That empire has peaked. Another one is lurking. We have real competition from China in the way we never had economically from the Soviet Union or from anyone else.
Okay.
It's the first real competitor in a century. There's no capacity to grasp it. The ideology that demonizes the government, what we call here libertarian stuff like that, makes that all of this opaque by misrepresenting it as socialism. The confusion, the denial. This is a system that is falling apart. And one of the things I realize is that that's in large part what is moving this country, which is that all kinds of people are beginning to glimpse what has been officially denied. And so more and more people watch Biden do what you, Yanis, rightly said. He's sort of a placeholder. He's really doing nothing. He's presiding over the decline of an empire. And, you know, when empires decline, there are still areas of strength. There are still areas of power and of growth. It's, as Marx taught us, it's an uneven development on the way up and on the way down. But I suspect that war or economic changes are going to be shaped by this combination of empire decline and the denial of this that is shaping American society.
I agree with you, Rick. There are two comments I have, two slight, not disagreements, but, you know, different angles that I would like to introduce. The first one is that these are not two empires. I think it is completely unfair on China to call it an empire. China has not invaded anyone. They had skirmishes with the Vietnamese, but these were border skirmishes. They didn't want to take over Vietnam. They have not done regime change. They have not, crashed democracies like they have in Greece, in Chile, in Iran, in the whole of Latin America, not just Chile. They have not killed millions of people in cruel wars, like in the one in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on. So that's, it's. I'm a bit harsher on the United States than you are. They come in, they bring money. Now, some of those loans are predatory. But if they do come with predatory loans to Europe, and they take over the Greek port, the Athens port, and so on, that's only because the European Union is not investing anything. So they're creating a vacuum, and Chinese money comes in. That's not exactly, we should beware concentrated power in the form of money, but it's not the same kind of the imperialism that Europeans and Americans have imposed upon the people of the earth. That's the first difference in angle.
Agreed.
The second one is that I do believe that the American industry still has a great deal of dynamism. It will continue to do so, even though I agree with you about the degeneracy of the political system, the complete failure of the macroeconomic management of the country, the loss of whole generations to destitution, deaths of despair, and so on. This is all correct. It's going down the toilet. But as you said, there are many strengths from which a great deal of dynamism is going to spring out in the United States. The United States will continue to create technologies that are mind-boggling. It will continue to be militarily dominant well after it has become economically subservient to the rest of the world. And that causes great jitters in my soul. Because when you have economic decline and military strength, that combination is lethal for humanity.
That's it. And it can lead the kind of politicians we have to take dangerous chances in a kind of gesture of gone power, as if the world hadn't changed.
Yeah, and
this has been
think of the Republican Party that is getting stronger and more united under Trumpism, while Biden is sitting there with the Democratic Party fragmenting between, our lot, the Democratic Socialists, and the Wall Street gang that is ruling the echelons of the Democratic Party.
I wish I could stay longer, but I cannot.
We have to do it again.
This is wonderful. Every time I talk to Yanis, it's a good time. So thank you, Yanis.
Bye, Rick. Take care.
Bye. You too, Yanis.
Thank you.